Hi everyone, and welcome back to Track 3, the Drug Development Future, Science, Policy Partnership, and Economics for our final breakout of the event. We hope you all had a great break and have enjoyed these last couple days at the Global Gene Summit. I am Katie Schwann, and I will be your host for today's session on the value of rare disease therapies, patient perspectives needed. This track is being live streamed, and I would like to welcome our remote attendees and remind everyone that you can use our Q&A live feature. A big topic of discussion in the rare disease community and drug development is the value of therapies and how to include the patients in this discussion. Today with us to share their expertise and knowledge is Khrystal Davis of Texas Rare Alliance and Sara van Geertruyden, Executive Director at Partnerships to Improve Patient Care.
Hello. When Danielle called me to first discuss this session, I was pumped. I am passionate about improving access to rare disease therapies. But that night, as I slept, I actually dreamt about this session. One by one, every attendee got up from their seats, turned their back, and walked out of the room. I'm not gonna lie, that was not one of my favorite dreams. And then I reflected, and I thought, that must be what it feels like for rare disease patients and caregivers when they're excluded from the discussion for value and coverage. The other stakeholders put it out, and they say, here, this is for you. And when they receive it, it may or may not include them. And so that's why we're here today. We're here to encourage those patients and caregivers to become active participants in those discussions on valuation and coverage so that in the end, they can impact the value and the coverage for them and their loved ones with rare diseases. So I joined the rare disease community in 2011. Our son Hunter was diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy type 1 at 8 weeks of age. He was diagnosed here at St. Louis Children's Hospital. The doctors told us there was no treatment and no hope. They sent us home and advised us to enjoy the time that we had left with Hunter, and the only thing they provided to help us was a prescription to hospice. Could I get back to the beginning slides, please? It's right there, please, thank you. And so this is a picture of a motor neuron, and Hunter's motor neurons were failing him fast. Our motor neurons connect our spinal cords to our muscles, and they transmit the messages for those muscles to move. And so without those, very quickly, next slide, please. Very quickly, SMA type 1 babies lose the ability to move, to swallow, and ultimately the ability to breathe. It's a very devastating disease that takes an emotional toll on the families. A family member is often holding the baby as it takes its last breath. So my advocacy actually began for Hunter in the beginning. Following his diagnosis, we refused to accept what the providers laid out for us. So we obtained the chemistry for a compound, we produced the compound, and then we took it to Mexico where a hospital and doctor provided it to Hunter. And so you can think of what we did as really a reverse Dallas Buyers Club story. Hunter received his treatments in Cancun every 6 weeks for nearly 5 years. And in addition to Hunter, there were 2 other babies treated. Next slide, please. And so this really weighed heavy on my heart. We secured access for Hunter, but what about all the other rare disease patients? And so in 2016, when a group of SMA moms approached me to join a grassroots effort to accelerate SMA treatments, I jumped at the chance. We attended a closed-door meeting with the FDA on May 4th, and we came to them with 4 asks. We asked for them to stop the placebo trial, provide pre-approval access for the weakest patients, to approve the therapy early, and to approve it for all of the SMA patients. And we came to them with patient experiential data from Facebook that showed the endpoint had been met. Next slide, please. The FDA actually responded very quickly. In June, they requested an interim look. In August, the FDA announced that the primary endpoint had been met. They stopped the placebo trial in August, and they worked with Biogen and established the EAP for type 1 patients. On December 23rd, the FDA gave our community the greatest gift ever. They approved our therapy early for all SMA patients, and it remains the fastest FDA-approved therapy to date. Thank you. And so you really have to advocate for others, not just for yourself. And we're going to go back to Children's Hospital and the Expanded Access Program. So all 12 trial sites were eligible to participate in the EAP. Unfortunately, for one reason or another, 4 opted not to participate. I advocated extensively at St. Louis Children's Hospital. I wrote memorandums, emails, made phone calls, had face-to-face meetings. And I was doing this to advocate for other children. The FDA and Hunter's providers knew about his treatments with amorpholino, so I didn't think that he would be able to access the MOE therapy in the EAP, and we would have to wait until post-approval. I was shocked when the FDA, or when St. Louis Children's called us and asked us to come in to dose Hunter. St. Louis was the largest participant in the EAP. They treated nearly 30 patients, and that's about the number of all the other sites combined. So patient advocacy matters at every point. Next slide, please. And approval does not guarantee access. On December 23rd, we were jumping for joy. We wiped our hands, we thought our work was done, and we were wrong. So 2018 was really a pivotal year for the rare disease community. It's the first time that the FDA approved more rare disease therapies than it did general therapies. When it comes to coverage, there are 2 primary issues. One comes to data. There never seems to be enough data, and the other goes to the cost of the therapy. With both of our approved therapies, there was extensive media coverage and outcry on the costs. Also, coverage does not equate to validation, especially when it comes to the rare disease patients. Coverage only validates the data that is included in the clinical trial, not the rare disease patients who need access to those therapies. And SMA is actually a really interesting case study. It is the leading genetic killer of babies absent therapy, and we have 2 really novel therapies that are among the first of their kinds. We have an antisense oligo and a gene replacement therapy, and they're also very pricey. Spinraza is $750,000 the first year and $375,000 each year thereafter. And Zolgensma is $2.1 million paid over 5 years. We do have a third contender, a small molecule, and we hope to see an NDA filed this year and approval next year. And so we're really focusing on the price of therapies but it's not the majority of our healthcare spending. If you look at the medical services, it really consists of about 60% of our overall healthcare spending. And it's really just an attempt to maintain the baseline health, and it's failing at that. And what we have in the 10% is rare disease therapies that are innovative therapies, really preventing symptoms, maintaining the baseline health, and oftentimes preventing the onset of the symptoms of the condition. It's also important to remember that rare disease patients consist of the majority of healthcare spending. The relatively small portion of patients drive much of healthcare spending, and we are in that group. And again, medical services and pharmaceuticals. We really need to shift those costs from medical services that are failing at maintaining the baseline health to novel therapies that can prevent the onset of those symptoms and provide better health outcomes. And so here you can see an example of that. In the first picture, you see a picture of our Hunter with a respiratory illness. He's in the PICU, he's intubated, medically sedated, and this admission cost over $1 million. Now, if you turn to the next picture, it's a very similar respiratory illness, and Hunter was treated at home. He returned to his baseline health in just a few short weeks. And so Hunter's had no hospitalizations since he started his Spinraza therapy. Now we turn to some of those who are evaluating our rare disease therapies. Among them is ICER, and they use the QALY, which is an arbitrary and subjective value for rare disease therapies. And it just doesn't work. These are not standard therapies, and you really can't provide standard valuations to them. And also we have payers who are adopting some of those valuations or considering it, and when they do so, it really elevates ICER to a de facto regulatory agency. And that's pretty scary to me as a rare disease parent, because ICER doesn't have any regulatory oversight that regulatory agencies have. And so it was really important for me when ICER evaluated Spinraza and Zolgensma that I attend and comment. And it was important for the SMA community to retain access to those therapies, but it's also important for the greater rare disease community. Again, these are novel therapies. They're ASO and a gene replacement therapy. And so how ICER treated those is likely to be extended to other ASOs and gene replacement therapies as they are approved for the rare disease community. And I talked about how the QALY fails. It failed to capture all of Hunter's medical costs. And if we add up everything at this point, his hospital costs and his long-term medical care, it's approached $3 million. We also have the emotional toll on our family and the time away from our other children. And if you recall that picture of Hunter intubated, at that time, my husband was in India. He's COO for his company, and he was on a business development trip. So he had to come home. And so that also impacted his company and the company's earning capacity. And that missed work and lost business not only impacted our family, but the other families at the company and the communities that we live in. And I also discussed the overall economic impact of SMA, because we really are focusing on the cost of the therapy, but what about the cost of having a rare disease? And so what I tried to do is develop a comprehensive rare disease impact analysis. And what it does, it takes into consideration what the payers are spending. And so that's the private insurers and the public insurers. And what are the public costs, such as the cost to the state for the educational interventions and accommodations and the first step programs, and then the substantial patient and caregiver costs. Rare disease patients frequently are required to stop working, as are caregivers to care for those rare disease patients. Before Hunter was born, I had been an attorney and represented the mortgage industry, and I intended to go back to work when Hunter went to kindergarten. The day that Hunter was diagnosed, I knew that I would never return to work. And so we have other costs, such as our PTO that is used for sick days and caring for our loved ones who are at home sick, as well as home modifications, accessible vehicles, medical nutrition that is not covered, and medical supplies and equipment that are not covered. And these are substantial costs. So I had an opportunity to ask acting FDA Commissioner Sharpless about this, and he was very animated. In his response, he said, "I'm with you. I hear you. We're focusing on the cost of these therapies and not on the outcomes that they provide to the patients." And when I prepared this, I didn't know that Representative Pelosi would file her bill. But it's really important to understand external price controls do not work. In the 70s, our government did this for gas, and we had gas shortages and gas rationing. If we do this to our rare disease therapies, that's what we're likely to see. And I don't want any rare disease patients. We only have 5% of our rare diseases that have therapies anyway. We don't want to see those therapies be denied and rationed. So I'm a Texan. What did work is embracing technology and innovation. When you go to the areas in Texas where they're pumping oil, you see pipelines, and you see trucks that are carrying crude oil. And that's because they embraced that technology that allowed them to drill and to frack. And that's what we need to do for rare disease therapies. Let's embrace that technology and innovation so we can drive the cost down that way. Next slide, please. And so we can do the same thing in trial design. We can employ innovation, and it's really needed. And one area that we can work on is inclusive trial design. We need to include patients from across the rare disease stages and understand how the treatment affects them, and include that data in the approval packet so payers can utilize that data in developing their coverage provisions. And so what we have right now is just an access conundrum. We're excluding the weakest patients from the trials, but then the payers are excluding them from access because they don't have data. Dr. Woodcock is a very strong proponent of inclusive trial design, and I took the opportunity to advocate for inclusive trial design by asking her to talk about it at BIO. And again, she provided a lengthy response, and it is a topic that she visits frequently. If you've ever been to London in the subway, you know what it means to mind the gap. We must mind the gap in the rare disease community. And what that means is that while we might be striving for pre-symptomatic diagnosis and treatment, we have to advocate to ensure access for the patients who are here today. If the treatment is likely to improve their health, stabilize their symptoms, or even slow the progression of the disease, we need to advocate so that they can secure access to the therapy. In June of 2018, the FDA filed draft guidance, and it really made it clear that manufacturers can engage in discussions with payers on the health economic data. And so that means they can start talking about coverage. And so we really need to go to the payers at that time too. If the manufacturers are talking about them, we need to go. We need to make sure that our concerns are also addressed. And one way that we can do that is we have advisory committees with the manufacturers. We need to be asking the payers to have similar advisory committees and tell them how the therapy impacts the rare disease community and how that therapy is likely to drive down the overall costs in the future. And I advocated heavily this last legislative session in Texas for newborn screening. And at that time, I also talked about the value of the therapy and how it would impact the state's economy. So when we ask for our states to start screening for a new condition, they also know that they're going to start treating that condition. And so it's important to say, yes, this treatment does have a high price tag, but the disease itself comes with a higher cost. And if we pre-symptomatically diagnose and treat, we're shifting those costs, but we're also going to save over the long term. And so that's what I did, and I also explained that if we wait to diagnose until we see symptoms, those symptoms are significant enough to trigger the Medicaid waiver program. When we pre-symptomatically diagnose and treat, that means that the private insurers will remain liable for paying for those therapies. And in this final slide, you can see our Hunter and Jen McNary's son, Max. And this is to point out that the ICER quality views these two patients worth less than a patient with average health. Hunter and Max are not worth less. ICER would have similarly found Stephen Hawking worth less. No rare disease patient is worth less. They are all priceless. Thank you.
You're tough to follow. Thank you. Oh, there you go. Is it working? Technical difficulties. Well, I'll just introduce myself while they're... my name is Sara Geertruyden with the Partnership to Improve Patient Care. Thank you for being here. I'm from Louisiana, so I have to say the big oil example that you had on the slide, I'm going to have to get that from you. That was really cool. Anyway, in Louisiana, that would have resonated really well. But anyway, first of all, thank you all for being here, because I know you probably all have a lot going on in your lives, and but I cannot underscore how important it is to be an advocate and what a difference it makes. Khrystal's advocacy has made a huge difference in terms of how people perceive and receive these kinds of value assessments, because it's these kinds of stories that really make a difference. As PIPSI, we're often on Capitol Hill and talking to leaders in the community that are, and think tanks, et cetera, about the challenges of these value assessments and how they're really not fit to be translated into coverage decisions and formulary decisions and tiering of your drugs, et cetera, because they do view people with disabilities, people with chronic conditions as worth less. So what I'm going to do today is to sort of walk you through a bit of the methodology, which is so please don't fall asleep, because it is a little bit complex, but I promise that when you leave here, you'll understand it a little bit better. You may not like it, but you'll at least understand it. And so the Partnership to Improve Patient Care is a coalition that was actually started back in 2008, 2009, with the consideration and debate around something called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. Tony Coelho, who is our chair, he wrote the Americans with Disabilities Act. He's a former congressman. He also has epilepsy. So he is very in tune to the challenges and needs of patients and people with disabilities. And when he started this coalition, his biggest goal was that he wanted patients not just to have a voice, but a vote. Right? I think that he would argue that one of the best things he accomplished with the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute is that there are 3 seats on the Board of Governors for patients. They have a vote on what PCORI funds in terms of the research. So we would be, and PCORI, by the way, is up for reauthorization this year, which we're strongly supporting, and I hope you are too. Oops, next slide. Oh, there we go. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this thing called a quality-adjusted life year. Who's heard of a quality-adjusted life year? Oh, good. Y'all are, this is much better than most audiences I get. All righty. Oh, this is the magic spot. Okay. So when you think about the cost per QALY, right? ICER assesses the cost of treatments based on the quality-adjusted life year. What they're looking at is what is the incremental improvement in somebody's health on this scale compared to the cost of the treatment. And that's how they decide whether it is worth it or not. So imagine here, a person in optimal health is a 1. A person who is not here anymore is a 0. What this chart actually doesn't reflect is they actually do also sometimes consider what we would call negative utilities, which also are known as states worse than death. We don't get into that here, but it is another component of some of their studies. So if you're a person who has had disease progression, say you're already in a wheelchair, a population of patients who tend to have disease progression, maybe have mobility challenges, would be maybe at a 0.5 at their optimal health, right? When they're sick, maybe they're at a 3. If the treatment would bring them from a 0.3 to a 0.5, then they would look at that as a 0.2 improvement. Now, if you can get somebody all the way to a 1, it's a 0.8 improvement. So the point that we're making here is that there's a fundamental discrimination in terms of how they view the value of a life of a person who has a chronic disease, who has experienced disease progression that won't be reversed by treating them. So this just outlines that 1, 0, and what's in between. But so look at this chart. So this is the World Health Organization uses these QALYs, and if you think about how Great Britain with their NICE, they also look at QALYs. But if you look at that, severe epilepsy, 0.5. Let's go to multiple sclerosis. Severe multiple sclerosis, 0.7. These are the different types of points. This is where they would put somebody on that scale of 0 to 1. This is the value that then is placed on the life of a person, so that extending the life of that person is viewed as less than extending the value of a life of a person who is at a 1. So there are some bioethicists who actually support these types of, this way of valuing treatments. Peter Singer is one of those. He's a bioethicist that is, he is not beloved in the disability community. So he actually says, okay, we should, they will very reasonably say, ask quadriplegics themselves to evaluate life with quadriplegia. If we do that and we find that quadriplegics would not give up even 1 year of life as a quadriplegic in order to have their disability cured, then the QALY method does not justify giving preference to procedures that extend the lives of people with disabilities over procedures that extend the lives of people with disabilities. And his conclusion with this rationale then is to say that this method of preserving our belief that everyone has an equal right to life is, however, a double-edged sword. If life with quadriplegia is as good as life without it, then there's no health benefit to be gained by curing it. So you can understand why he's controversial in the community. But this is the rationale that falls behind the cost per quality methodology that's used by these organizations like ICER. So the way that you get to that quality number, whether it's a 0.5 or a 0.4 or whatever it is, they do that with population surveys. So what happens is that the organization will send out a survey to the general population. These are not surveys sent to the people who actually are experiencing that condition. These are surveys that are sent to the general population. Some of you may have seen in JAMA a few years ago, there was a whole article about states worse than death, where they had done these surveys and they said, would you rather be blind or dead? And some people would say, oh, I would never want to live in that state. I would rather not be here at all. And that's where they then get these ideas of what they call negative utility, states worse than death, which also sometimes feed into these quality calculations. But they're using survey models of the general population that don't experience a disability. So if you have a disability, raise your hand if you think your life has value, right? Of course you do. You probably don't feel like your life has any less value than somebody who may not have a condition or a chronic disease or a disability, right? So I think what's missing here is that these general surveys are just a very poor way of establishing sort of that baseline of what the value is of a life of a person in a year. If you look at the other challenges with the quality model, I've talked a little bit about states worse than death. And the other piece of it that's really tough is that when you talk about the incremental gains, and I think Khrystal got to this when she was talking about the experience that she's had with Hunter, and I think it came up a lot in the spinal muscular atrophy assessment that ICER did, that sometimes even the smallest incremental improvement in health. So think about that chart I had before with the 1 to the 0 and all the points in between. If you improve somebody's health condition to go between a 0.2 and a 0.5, right, that might look like only a 0.3 improvement. But to the person who's experiencing that improvement in health, it's huge, right? It's the difference between Khrystal being able to go back to work or not, her husband not having to come home from India from his business trip, and for the person who's experiencing that condition, right? It's the difference between them being able to go to school, get out of bed, go play with their friends, But the point is that something that might be through survey models, it might look like a really small thing. To the person who is living with that condition, it's huge. So we're going to talk a little bit about something called the equal value life year gained. I won't spend too much time on this, but so ICER has come up with this new, it's really a spin-off of the quality adjusted life year. And the reason that I'm bringing it up is because they have communicated to policymakers and to others that use their studies that because they now have a companion calculation called the equal value life year gained, that they have fixed the discrimination problem of the quality adjusted life year. And what's important to know about the equal value life year gained is that it's still a spinoff of the quality adjusted life year. The only thing that it does is to partially mitigate the life extension problem by valuing everybody at the same number. So you think about that place on that chart between 0 and 1. What it does not do is to fix the issue of that incremental health improvement and the value that that has for the person who is experiencing that condition. So it does nothing to fix that problem, and they're still using that kind of survey data to evaluate how those incremental health improvements are valued then in their calculation. It also doesn't address the undervaluing of quality of life improvements and clinical knowledge that don't go into the assessments that ICER has because they tend to base them on preclinical trials or pre-approval trials. Here, sorry. There we go. And so when you think about it, so when they think about the quality, right, you have different QALYs based on mild, moderate, severe. When you wake up in the morning and you think about how you're feeling, are you thinking about it in the context of mild, moderate, or severe? Probably not. If you look at these the disability status scales that are often used when we think about quality measures and other things, right? We don't think about how we feel in those mild, moderate, severe terms. There's usually a much more robust description of different states in terms of where somebody is in their disease or their progression, right? So requires a walking aid, requires 2 walking aids. These are not mild, moderate, and severe, but that's how QALYs work. So the real challenge with this measurement is that no matter who you are, no matter what you're doing, you're going to be lumped into this average assessment of the value of a life of a person with that condition, and that is going to be the basis then of a calculation that they will make for the treatment to improve that person's quality of life. And Tony loves to say this, and if you ever see a statement from him, it almost always says, no patient is average. QALYs are just incapable of responding to the fact that different people respond differently to the same drugs. And this is part of why PIPSI has been so supportive of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, because by statute, their research looks at subpopulations. It's intended to try to figure out, why does this patient respond better to this treatment than that patient, in order to help patients that then look like them make decisions about their health care, because it adds some predictability. And then for many conditions, these disparities in terms of how treatments affect different people might be known by your doctor, right? Because they're treating people with these conditions, and I would think this is particularly relevant in rare diseases. But it's not necessarily being captured yet in the clinical data that's being used then that drives these value assessments. I want to move on a little bit. I think we've covered this. So let's talk a little bit about what ICER is. So these are some of the value assessments that ICER has done in the past. You've heard about spinal muscular atrophy, cystic fibrosis, tardive dyskinesia. Moving forward, they have just put out what they're going to intend to study in 2020. Sickle cell is one of them that's new. They just started that study. They're also looking at a blood disorder, hemophilia A. They're going to be looking at multiple sclerosis again. Wet age-related macular degeneration. And so you might be wondering, how did this group get to be so entrenched? We ask ourselves that a lot. So ICER was founded in 2006, primarily it was intended and supported by insurers to help them make coverage decisions. They wanted this kind of data, what's cost effective, what's not cost effective, so that to help them make formulary decisions. In 2016, they sort of got on the national radar because something called the Innovation Office, CMMI, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, introduced a Part B proposal that would have changed how Medicare pays for Part B drugs, and they proposed to use ICER studies to help them determine coverage. In 2017, then ICER, we did beat that back, and it never was implemented, but it was proposed. The Department of then in 2017, ICER partnered with the VA. That did move forward. The VA now has an active partnership with ICER to establish its national formulary. And then after that, the Arnold Foundation provided ICER with $13.9 million. Since then, they've given them a lot more. And now ICER is collaborating with New York and New York's Drug Utilization Review Board. As you may know, New York has a drug cap, which I'll talk about later, that plays in there. And then as Khrystal mentioned, CVS Caremark announced then in 2018 that they would be partnering with ICER also to have a limit of $100,000 per QALY for their benefit design for certain employer clients. As you can imagine, the community was not very happy about that. A letter was sent. CVS has not implemented that plan, but I think it's certainly indicative that payers take ICER's studies very seriously. So right now, ICER is actually trying to establish a framework for how they're going to assess cures. One of the things that they have proposed is to have a definition of rare and ultra-rare. So they created this new, what they call ultra-rare category of diseases with patient populations of less than 10,000. NORD has been very critical of this proposal. They've typically opposed efforts to create an ultra-rare category in other settings. It's not a definition that exists anywhere else, whether in statute or other government or any government programs. I think another thing to think about with ICER is that in terms of their impact on innovation, they use a short-term affordability threshold in their framework. And this sets a threshold for spending on all new medicines, regardless of the patient populations or burden of the condition, and has far-reaching consequences. So there's an inverse relationship between the number of FDA approvals per year and the budget impact. If this arbitrary budget cap were implemented, it could have the effect of limiting companies from continuing to invest in novel treatments. And it only takes into consideration the price of the drug and not the health system savings of new potentially curative treatments, which I think Khrystal did a really nice job of talking about in her slides as well. Also, ICER relies on the QALY, which I talked about earlier. They tend to do their assessments when the drug is coming to market, when there's very little data, particularly on subpopulations. They're just looking at the pre-market data, the data that FDA was considering when it approved the product. And they have a tendency to not do a great job of patient engagement and consider the outcomes that matter to patients. So we actually looked at this, and they only considered patient input and incorporated it about half the time. Here's the good news. In the past, we as a country have not used QALYs. As far back as 1992, Oregon actually had a waiver that they proposed that would have used the quality-adjusted life year to determine their prioritized list of services. The disability community said, absolutely not, that would discriminate. Keep in mind, this was right after the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. So that waiver was actually rejected by HHS. And they said that they anticipated that the state would actually get sued over it. This is a statement that came out of the New York Times by the then HHS secretary in the first Bush administration. And they said they thought it was a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Additionally, the 2010 Affordable Care Act includes a ban on use of QALYs in Medicare and by PCORI. And so why does this matter? So in Medicaid programs, if we were to reference ICER, if that was sort of the standard, between 42 and 99% of patients across 5 disease areas would be required to switch treatments. And the same thing with Medicare Part B, between 55 and 62% of patients across 4 disease areas that we looked at would be required to switch treatments. And it impacts MS patients most significantly, just based on the 4 conditions that were looked at in that study. And we've actually looked, too, at the ICER partnership with the VA to see if it's actually having any sort of meaningful impact, and it does seem to be. 42 of the drugs that ICER deemed to be of low or intermediate value are not covered on the VA formulary. And we're now watching, too, to make sure that the Department of Defense does not move in the same direction. So in terms of federal policy threats, some of you may have heard about this International Price Index. It's a proposal that the president has talked about. Now the House of Representatives is considering, in this slide I say that they're considering binding arbitration. The House actually came out with this bill yesterday. They dropped the language. What it says is that they are going to send some of the most expensive drugs to something called negotiation. When they say negotiation, they mean that they're going to set a price, and they will set that price based on what other countries pay for those products, other countries that, and I'll get to this, but that typically do not cover a lot of these treatments. And also, they would base it on something called comparative effectiveness research They do not include a quality ban in that bill, so we're very concerned that when they say comparative effectiveness research, what they mean is that they would look at studies such as those that are conducted by ICER. And so on the international front, we know that patients are struggling with access. And when Khrystal was talking, I was thinking about a story that I read from Australia. It was a news story. A gentleman in that country who had spinal muscular atrophy. He was over the age of 18. He talked about how he had been, waiting for this product, Spinraza, to come, for his whole life. And then Australia, because of a cost effectiveness and the value that was looked at under a cost effectiveness and quality-based methodology, the country said, we'll give this product to children under the age of 2, but not to adults. And I think they had a phase-in. But because of the disease progression, they did not feel like it was worth it to give Spinraza to someone who was at advanced stages of the disease. So that's just an example of what happens in other countries that use these kinds of value standards and to determine what they will or will not cover. And so we're also really worried about states because more and more states seem to be advancing these kinds of policies to limit formularies based on these kinds of cost-effectiveness standards. And that, in large part, that's because this administration has really opened the door to that. There's a 5-state demonstration in the president's budget that would welcome states to make drug coverage decisions that meet state needs in Medicaid. While the Massachusetts proposed waiver wasn't passed, the response that CMS gave to Massachusetts was, you know what, we'll let you do a limited formulary if you base it on cost effectiveness. The only reason they denied that waiver had to do with their participation in the rebate program. New York is already doing this, and the concern that we've had is that New York is now is starting to be looked at by other states as a model. They have a drug cap. They're looking at ICER studies to create a value for products. They've already looked at the value of products based on ICER studies with Orkambi. They're also recently were looking at it for migraine drugs. And in New York, they have the ability then to kick products off of their formulary if they don't meet cost-effectiveness standards. Massachusetts is looking at New York. There are a lot of disability groups in Massachusetts that have been really great and effective advocates to push back on moving in the same direction as New York. They're really working hard to get a quality ban in that legislation. And then here in California, the Legislative Analyst Office has actually made recommendations to the California legislature, and we're noticing in other states too that their drug utilization review boards are looking at these types of models. So we, in terms of principles, I think, people will often ask, if not ICER, then what? What are you for? This is what we're for. We want value assessments that acknowledge the diversity and differences among patients and people with disabilities, that aren't misused by payers and policymakers, that are developed using transparent processes and methods, that meaningfully engage patient and provider organizations, rely on sound patient-centered sources of evidence, address costs and benefits that matter to the patient, and produce evidence on the value of treatments based on patient-centered outcomes. I think one of the most egregious things that we often hear about ICER is that on their voting panels, on the panels that actually vote at the end of the day on what is the value of this treatment, they will not include patients or clinicians that actually treat that disease on the voting panel. They keep them on advisory panels, but they won't let them vote. And that's one of the big challenges that we think they should change. So if you don't like the use of value assessments that discriminate, please advocate. We have those principles that you just saw, we're calling Value Our Health. We are always welcoming new logos on that to show broad support for value assessments that don't discriminate. We just ask that you continue to educate folks on these issues. It's complicated stuff, but what's happening is, is that this country is moving in a direction of using these types of metrics to determine what they will or will not cover. And think about it, when you do get denied access to a treatment, ask why. Find out from your insurer, whoever your payer is, try to get as much information as you can about why. Because if it's based on equality, there's a good argument for discrimination. And anytime that you're looking at public policies in your own state, always look for these buzzwords: value, cost effectiveness, reference to third parties. When they talk about reference to third parties, they're probably talking about ICER. And so these are just some of the groups that, that support those principles that I was just talking about. It's a good mix of lots of different organizations, but all on the same page, that value assessments should be more patient-centered, and that we need to be thinking about the value of treatments in the context of individuals and not averages. So thank you. We're happy to take questions.
Great job.
Hi there. Thank you so much. That was a very, very wonderful presentation of something that's very difficult to understand for I think most people. So I work in the Duchenne community, and I have a brother who is on one of those very expensive therapies, an ASO that costs for our health insurance company about $2 million a year. So that's not $2 million over 5 years, that's $2 million every year for the rest of his life. And we think it's worth it. We
Right.
think his ability to feed himself, his ability to sit 6 inches up in bed is wonderful, and we believe that it's valuable. But how do you make the economic, social, public health argument that that is worth it to people that are looking, managing those Medicaid budgets and looking at what needs to get cut from other types of programs that help other kids? How do you make that argument that this young man and his $2 million drug is worth the funds that are going to be taken away from other patients as our Medicaid budgets begin to shrink? So I think that's one question that I have. What is the social, argument there? What is the economic argument there? What is the public health argument there? And then the second question I have is, with ICER, obviously they're not voted on. They weren't voted into office. They're not overseen by any type of branch of government. But if there were an opportunity to provide patient input in a really meaningful way, similar to how you do at FDA, how do you get that body of individuals that can accept that input, interpret it, and then put it make it transparent, right? Because right now that process isn't transparent. There's no ICER patient affairs staff. So who do you go to? Like in our community, we always went to FDA. And then the third question I was asking is, we know that the patients who are sicker, they benefit more from even the smaller benefit, right? And the healthcare economic theory, it'll tell you that. But how do you capture that? How do you capture that difference? Is it some type of global impression of change, of what's changing in your household? How do you capture that and put a value on it? Like, what? Do you understand my question? My 3 questions?
Yeah. Okay. So let me start with the beginning. I think from an ethical standpoint, I would argue that we shouldn't say that a patient even has to be cost effective in order to take care of them, right? I think as a country, that's just the wrong lens to take in this discussion. There are a lot of ways that our healthcare system can save money. And I don't think it should have to be on the backs of our most vulnerable folks. It doesn't. So I think, that is the lens, right? That people who support QALYs, the Zeke Emanuels and the Peter Singers and the Steve Pearsons, that's the lens through which they do determine value. And I would argue that there are a lot of very smart people out there looking for ways to improve healthcare that does save money. Fail first policies don't save this country money, right? If you think about, there are a lot of ways, if you get people on the right care at the right time and manage their conditions, they're going to be in the hospital a lot less. You heard this from Khrystal, right? Now that her son is on Spinraza, his hospitalizations are almost null. So that is a cost savings to the system. So I don't think, anyway, I would argue that it's just the wrong lens.
Unfortunately, the issue is that for some of these young men, especially in the Duchenne space, there isn't going to be a cost effectiveness. There
Right.
isn't, $2 million a year is not going to outweigh what Jet would be, using in healthcare. He's going to still have the same amount of doctor's visits. He's going to still have the same amount of surgeries, for some
Right.
communities, right?
But again, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean your brother's not worth it, right? So I think that we as a country have to make a commitment that we're either going to take care of people or and that we're going to value the lives of everyone here. And unfortunately, in other countries, that's not the case, right? They do make those kinds of decisions, and I think we would argue that we as a country are different and better than that. On your second question about ICER and how to get patient input incorporated, I think the challenge that we've had, because I often get this question, you probably get this too, if not ICER, then what? Then how are we going to figure this out, right? And I think it's not like the quality is the only game in town. There's multi-criteria decision analysis. There are all these other ways that you can think about the value of treatments. The problem is that they're not getting $20 million from the Arnold Foundation to develop those methodologies and to try to figure out how to use them in a non-discriminatory way. Unfortunately, ICER just is well-funded, is pretty much what it boils down to, which is why I think, from our perspective, we get really riled up and scared to think that of the sheer possibility that ICER could ever get like a large government contract to become a self-sustaining organization that gets entrenched, right? And then now it's almost like, because they will continue to say qualities are the gold standard. And every time we go in there and we say, we really don't think qualities are the gold standard, and here's our problems with the methodology, and we break it down for them, their response is qualities are the gold standard. We're not going to change ICER. So we've got to figure out how to, and I don't know where the investment's going to come from, but I would argue that PCORI is one of those organizations that's doing a really good job. PCORI doing patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness research that really looks at subpopulations, focuses on those clinical outcomes, really gets down into the weeds of, this treatment helps people in this way or that way, looking at outcomes that matter to patients because patients are engaged in the research. That's the kind of model that we should be replicating and investing in. Unfortunately, ICER's, they're getting a lot of money from a foundation.
I would add that each of your questions really points out that ICER is mastering the art of misdirection. We're not focusing on the medical services. And when we're focusing on the cost effectiveness of the therapies, we're not focusing on the pre-symptomatic diagnosis and treatment that could help those coming up in the Duchenne community from having the symptoms. We need to really be moving towards pre-symptomatic diagnosis and treatment.
I agree.
Thank you.
You want me to ask my question?
One more question, please.
Sorry.
So you guys really hit the nail on the head on a lot of fronts. Both great presentations. Thanks very much. The importance of patient-defined values can't be understated because we're on a slippery slope here.
Right.
As we start to look at comparative pricing in an NHS system, and even when it comes to cost, the definer of cost or the definition of cost varies by whose cost is involved. A private payer will take into account different type of cost equation than the government payer, and neither of those takes into account fully the patient's perspective on cost. And I had dinner with the head of NHS many years ago. I won't say who it was, but Nigel told me that he said, he said, Patrick, I have a bag of resources that I have to distribute amongst as many people as I can. And some people are just, they're not going to get as much. But I have to do the most good for the most people. And I said, Nigel, the cheapest outcome is death.
Right. Exactly. And this is where we get into the issue of negative utilities. I mean, it's a wrong-headed way to be thinking about how we treat our own. It's not right.
Yeah, I got the deer in headlights look. He had to excuse himself shortly thereafter. But ultimately, there is one leverage point that has been brought to my attention many times. By the way, does anybody here represent any payers? So we have industry here, we have patients here, we have scientists here. We don't have payers here.
Not for lack of trying.
Yeah. Well, let me share with you a little insight with regard to what a payer told me when it came to reimbursement. So I represent a manufacturer. Alta Bio is the company's name, and we're developing a therapy for a rare disease. But this was at a previous company. Talking to a panel of payers about what's the value proposition and how should we communicate this and so on and so forth. Ultimately, one of the payers, he just threw his pencil on the table and he said, "Look, Patrick," he said, "at the end of the day, I don't want my picture on the front page of the newspaper saying I denied coverage to this child." And what that tells me is that there is leverage that the patient community has, because the payers, the private payers, are in competition to get, but we're called lives in their business model, right? We have 1 million lives or 10 million lives, and they're in competition to get as many people into their systems as possible to spread risk as greatly as possible. And to the extent that something puts in jeopardy their ability to entice people to enroll in their program, they pay attention to it. And negative publicity is one of those things. And patients absolutely have the ability to shed that light on payers who are unwilling to reimburse and pay for access to the therapies that patients find valuable. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
If other people have questions and they want to come up here afterwards, I'm more than happy. I think we can still answer some more questions afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Khrystal and Sara, for sharing your experience and knowledge on this very important topic. This concludes our final breakout of the 2019 Rare Patient Advocacy Summit. We have a quick 15-minute break before moving into the main ballroom for our closing session, and would like to remind everyone that as we make this transition, that any questions you may have for our speakers can be asked as we move rooms. On your way out, please check out the remaining resources outside the room. I want to thank you all for joining us in this last session. We hope you learned a lot and ask at this time to take our quick survey on the mobile app. Thank you again.
Thank you.